All right, I'm going to use the mic because we have it. It's a novelty. So, good morning. I'd like to introduce, welcome all. Actually, let's do, while everyone's getting in, let's just take a moment and let's bring ourselves. All right. Sorry. Are you ready, Bonnie? Let's bring ourselves into this space. Remember that we are, as always, today in the presence of the Lord. Maybe as we're preparing ourselves, opening our hearts for the conversation we're about to have, try and remember what we're thankful for today. It's the beginning of the day. What is it, something that's already occurred that we're thankful to the Lord for? Let's try to bring and remember that thankfulness, that gratitude, bring that into our conversation and approach the rest of our day this morning with that same thankfulness and gratitude. I think our conversation may challenge us, it may be difficult, but let's try as we walk through it to remember what we are grateful for and that we're grateful we can have this conversation together. In the name of the Lord. Amen. All right, so let me introduce Professor Marsha Chatelaine. She's an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. She's the author of The South Side Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration. Marsha's a public voice on the history of African American children, race in America, as well as social movements. In 2014, she organized her fellow scholars in a social media response to the crisis at Ferguson. You may have heard of it. It was called hashtag Ferguson Syllabus. Actually, I think some of it was used here at Trinity. And it's led to similar initiatives online and has shaped curricular projects in the K-12 setting, as well as other parts of academia. Marsha has contributed to a ton of well-respected publications. I can't even read them all, but I'm going to highlight a few of them. And TV and radio. The Atlantic, Time, Chronicle of Higher Education, The Washington Post, C-SPAN, MSNBC. You get it. People trust her voice. She's intelligent and amazing. She also hosts The Office Hours, a podcast which talks to millennials about what's important to them. Okay, and finally, Marsha is a proud graduate of the University of Missouri, Columbia, where she was a Harry Truman scholar, and she holds a PhD in American Civilization from Brown. In 2016, she was named a top influencer in higher education by the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she has been a fellow with both the New America Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Let's welcome Marsha Chatelaine.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful morning. It's great to be here. I'm a neighbor of Holy Trinity as faculty in residence at Georgetown, and I just came back from seeing my mother in Chicago, and she is a devout Catholic. She's at church every morning, and she was saying how, what did she say to me? She said, you see what going to Catholic school has given you, all that hard work to put you in Catholic school. She said, everything you do now is because we put you in the types of schools that allowed you to think about your values. We talked about my old forensics coach, Sister Diane, who spent her life trying to cultivate communication skills among young people. We talked about going to a Jesuit high school, and she said, see what going to Mass every week in Catholic school gives us. So for that, I'm grateful. And the fact that I am at a church on a Saturday morning would make her very happy. So I come here with a deep feeling of gratitude for not only the values that I was raised with, but the fact that church communities, the one thing that we have above all other types of institutions is a common vocabulary. We can pray the same prayers, we can speak the same language, and we can struggle with the same things with the confidence and with the knowledge that at the very least we start from the same place. And so today I hope that we can have a conversation in which we are reminded that we are starting with the same place. And that same place is a belief that our faith not only calls us to action, but our faith provides us the pathway to not only reconcile with people and communities that have been vilified, but reconcile with ourselves for the pain, intentional and unintentional, that we have brought into the world. And so with that, I can say that I am on the road quite a bit. 30 to 40 times a year I'm speaking with different communities, but there's nothing like going to a Catholic church and speaking to people of faith who are grappling with what I think is probably one of the most challenging periods of recent memory. And so I hope that we can remember that as we talk about what's happening in the world, what's happening inside of all of us, and ways that we can think of ourselves as not only observers, but active participants in imagining a different way of living and interacting with people and with the world. So I want to start with this idea of naming the nation's original sin. As you know, at Georgetown University, we have been engaged in a process over the past 3 years around the university and slavery. And one of the challenges of this type of work is to help people understand the importance of telling an honest story about the nation's past. As a historian, people, this is, classic, I get into a taxi, what do you do for a living? I'm a history professor. I hated history as a kid, it was the worst class. But as I've gotten older, people often say, I appreciate it more and more, because I think for all of us, we realize that information about the past isn't designed to topple heroes. It isn't designed to make us feel bad about institutions or people that we once admired, but it allows us to get a more sophisticated and complicated view of our origins and appreciate and reconcile the tensions within it. So when we think about the past and we think about our call as followers of Jesus Christ, I often think about this moment, and Sister Marilyn has heard me talk about this so many times. But
it's so important.
Thank you. But I think about Charlottesville in 2017, and for me, as someone who always enjoyed school, someone who loved school so much that I became a college professor, I think about time probably a little differently than some of my colleagues in other fields. For me, a new year begins in August and it concludes in May. And then everything in between doesn't count. And it's about a kind of regeneration process. So the beginning of the school year is how I remember certain points in my life. If someone says, what was 1997 like? It would be sketchy. But if I think to myself, 1997 was the year I started college. It was the beginning of a pivotal journey in my life. And so for me, those first few weeks in August are a sacred time for so many young people who are beginning that journey into not only the college experience of gaining knowledge, but the opportunity to know something about themselves. And so when I watched this unfold at the University of Virginia and in the Charlottesville community in 2017, all I could think about is what this meant for the introduction to a generation of young people to this experience that had been so pivotal and formative for me. But the other part of this story that I think we missed in the analysis of it, that it wasn't just about a fringe hate group that decided to organize around a symbol of the Confederacy. This was about a kind of temptation that I think that people of faith are presented in this world every day. And when we talk about ideas of white supremacy, we think about these dramatic acts of violence. But in many ways, I think about Jesus' temptation in the desert. And I think about Satan appearing before Jesus and saying, look, if you just worship me, look at all of these riches that you can have. And in that moment of temptation, Jesus declaring to Satan that he refused to bow down before him because he had a vision of something that was more true and more honest and more real. And in many ways, I think that in our nation, as we see the ways that racial divisions determine the quality of people's life, the quantity of security they feel, in many ways, I think Americans, particularly white Americans, are presented with this challenge each and every day. If one bows down before white supremacy, the nation has taught you that you can have the very best schools for your kids, that you have better opportunities than some others in employment, that you will live a longer life, that you will have access to the very best health care. that you will live a life of security and strength if you would only bow down before a system that says some people are more valuable than others. Some people's lives require the fullness of compassion and others can be thrown away. That people who are seeking safety and security, they can be met with pepper spray at the border. That women can be told that their pain is unimportant after they deliver a child in a hospital and then lose their life. All of these issues are brought before us every day in this country. And what we find is, in these moments, the dramatics and the violence, these seem like a very clear wrong. But every day in this country, a deal is brokered between integrity and division, between honesty and lies and duplicity. And so in thinking about how to talk about the issue of racism and racial justice in this country, I always return to that moment of temptation, because I think that what we have failed to do as not only faith communities, but as citizens of the same nation, is to present to future generations the possibility of rejecting racism, of rejecting white supremacy, and embracing the possibility that something else, justice and equality, can feel even richer and more fulfilling. And so in the absence of a model that says that another way is possible, how in our everyday lives, how in our faith practices, how in our faith communities can we make that real to others who are also struggling with this sense of temptation? I think a lot about where we are in terms of visual spaces. When you teach very eager undergraduates like I do at Georgetown, they always want to see what you're talking about. So you tell students something and they say, is that true? And they always want to see it. Marilyn, you know what I'm talking about. And so I like to use these various maps so that students can kind of see where we are. So we live in a nation where racism is essentially the externalization of contempt for people because of their racial identity. And we show that contempt by withholding care, justice, or safety. If we think about the things that we all want as human beings, the first thing is we want care. We want, in moments where we are broken, moments in which we are distraught or in despair, we want someone to care about us. And I think that if we are fortunate to perhaps have families and friends and communities that care for us, this question of care doesn't seem like a pressing one. But for far too many people, I think, because of who they are, there's always a question if care will actually be available to them. Each and every one of us has a sense of justice. People sometimes ask me, how do you talk to small children about these issues? And I say, kids understand justice very well. If you take 2 3-year-olds in front of you and give 2 cookies to one 3-year-old and half a cookie to the other 3-year-old, they will probably, protest in ways that will be fit for a Supreme Court argument, right? They understand justice. And each and every one of us has a vision of justice. And when justice feels denied systematically, when justice is denied in swift ways, we feel disconnected from the possibility that our humanity is being recognized. And safety. Each and every one of us seeks safety in the world. And for some of us, our safety comes from knowing that we live in homes and communities, that if there's a breach in that safety, someone will take it seriously. We feel safe when we know that if we are injured, there will be someone who desires to remedy that injury. And so all of these things that we seek as people, the scourge of racism disorders that. And so there is always a looming question whether you can have access to care, justice, or safety. And so when people believe that they don't have access to care, justice, and safety, what can you ask of them? What are the things that we can really believe in investment? In the midterm elections, it's so interesting to read these stories about voter suppression and voter efforts, right? And people come down and they say, how do you get people who are disconnected from the democracy to register to vote? And how do you get those same people to stand in long lines in order to vote? And how do you get people to think about the problems in their community and run for office? And these seem to be very perplexing questions. But if a person does not believe that care, justice, or safety is available in the world, what can we ask? What can we ask? But then it illuminates a more important question. How can we show that we have the capacity as individuals and within our faith communities to show that there is an ethic of care, justice, and an ability to deliver safety to communities that have never seen it before? How transformative would that be in so many processes if every church said, we will spend 1 year, just 12 months, on emphasizing the care, justice, and safety of communities we never see or interact with? What an amazing set of possibilities. This is another map. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is another way in which we see the world we live in, right? And that our definition is about voting patterns and voting blocks, the decisions that people make between two choices. And this is also another way in which I see my students configuring the world, right? This can't tell us anything about human complexity or human process, but boy, is this a powerful tool in making decisions. I am probably the greatest offender of this, right? I see the map, I make decisions. I see this map and I make assumptions. I see this map and I make a determination of how I'm going to proceed. And so in many ways, these maps help us remember that we can configure a nation, we can configure a church, we can configure a family or a community in many different ways. But underneath all of it is a structure. And so one of the things I think is really important for us to engage is this question of structural racism, because it normalizes inequality in the places that are designed to meet the health, housing, nutritional, educational, legal, and social needs of people. When we normalize inequality, we find ourselves thinking that either inequality is just the way things are, or even worse, that inequality is necessary to maintain the ways that we live. This is always a very difficult question to ask my students. I'll ask them, are people fundamentally good or bad? Mind you, most of these kids actually went to Catholic school, and they'll say, well, most people are just self-interested, and they're probably pretty bad. And when I hear that, I say, well, why would you say that? And they say, well, in any system, there's always going to be someone who wins and someone who loses. I said, okay, does that bother you? And they say, yeah, but I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. And we can say that it's generational cynicism, but when I imagine the world that my students live in is the same world that I live in, can I even make an argument for anything else? Do I even have any ground to stand on to tell a generation of young people that there's no need for winners and losers, that there's nothing inevitable about inequality, that we can actually do something about it? And they say, that's very nice, Professor Chatelaine, we're gonna move on now, right? Do we imagine opportunities to show and demonstrate that something else is possible? Or do we merely understand inequality as just a matter of form? What happens when we resign ourselves to that conclusion? This is another map that has become increasingly important for myself as an educator and for others. This is a map of all the hate groups that have organized in the United States in the past 20 years. And the various symbols represent anti-Semitic Nazi groups, white nationalist groups, groups that attacked people based on country of origin, groups that target the LGBT community. This is what the nation looks like for some communities that feel particularly vulnerable. And these maps help us understand that we can never become comfortable with the idea that because we live in a major metropolitan area, because we live in places where people are deeply educated, because we live in places in which there seems to have been tremendous social progress over the past 5 decades, that this ideology isn't enticing or interesting to members of our community. one of the things that I think was particularly helpful for us to understand after Charlottesville, and with the growing news coverage about groups that are broadly known as the alt-right, or groups that are broadly known as white nationalists, is the high levels of education of some of their leaders or members. That we want to believe that it's because a deep ignorance exists in some parts of the country that people are radicalized towards these ideas. But one of the things that we have to remember is that there is a vast expanse of intellectual ideologies that justify hate. And I think that when we look at a map like this, it's particularly sobering for us to think about these old ways of thinking about how to fight injustice. It's not just a matter of education, but it's visible action in communities and experiences. And so when we think about bias as an unfounded or narrowly drawn preference or affinity for people or peoples at the expense of building substantive and loving relationships with others, we can see the ways that a person is attracted to an ideology of hate, and they look around them and they see confirmation that there is a place for this hate to not only grow, but there are also communities that in their silence around this hate give tacit approval to it. These maps have been particularly powerful for also thinking about how these groups in many ways use the ways that churches organize their communities to get their members in. I don't know if you were familiar with a young man named Derek Black. He was featured in the Washington Post because he left white nationalism. His father had started Stormfront, which is one of these online sites that radicalizes people. His godfather was David Duke, who was a former leader of the KKK, and he grew up in this ideology. He left it behind and he came to Georgetown to talk to the students, and I interviewed him, and one of the things that was mind-blowing to me is he said, we're not a religious group, we don't consider ourselves Christians, but we do a lot of the things that churches do. We tell people that we have the real truth. We have social activities for kids, we have picnics and barbecues, we spend time together, we build a community in order to raise people in this ideology. I was raised in this, and I was kind of taken aback, but I understand the deep desire for community, the deep desire to belong, and you can see the susceptibility of the human heart to go in a number of directions. And I wondered, what if there were alternatives to this community that were made visible to him and other families like his? What other things could have been possible? And he talks about the experience of leaving this behind. And there was a deep poignancy that he wasn't just leaving behind racism and hate, he was also leaving behind his family, his parents, his siblings, the friends he grew up with. And so when we think about our role within church communities to provide people a space that gives them the community and the love that these hate groups had once done, it makes us incredibly aware of the power of our own communities to welcome people in and allow them to see a different way in which people can unify in their relationship to the larger world. Another map that I like to think about is, this is a racial dot map, and this map was done by the University of Virginia's Cooper Center, and they take census data and they do a dot rendering of every kind of racial group in America. Blue representing white, red is Asian, green is African American, and there's yellow for Latinos. And one of the things I like to do when I go somewhere is I do the dot map of where I am. So this is the dot map of our neighborhood. You see Canal Northwest, you see MacArthur, and you see Foxhall. And you see the ways that segregation is so powerful in our everyday lives. And segregation is that meeting of structural racism and interpersonal racism, and it shapes all aspects of American life, from school to neighborhood to church. This one is also a tough sell for my students who grew up in this world, and I say, but there's a possibility that we can live in communities together and we can build things together, But 99% of the young people I teach, 99% of the communities that they come from, how their parents were raised, and their parents were raised, and the ways that they will probably live in the future look like this. And they say, Professor Chatelaine, nice try, but I think you're incorrect. And I don't actually have very strong examples. But one of the things that we know about segregation is that it's probably one of the ways that we normalize inequality to each other, to younger people, and this is one of the ways that this appears in our everyday life as the backdrop of how the world is. And I think it's particularly powerful to look at these maps. This is Washington, D.C. If you take a few zooms out and you look at 16th Street and Rock Creek Park as the ultimate divide. These trends will change as the demographics of the city change, but one of the things that I think is important to understand is that as a result of this type of segregation, we develop scripts. And racial scripts comprise what our families, schools, churches, neighborhoods, political parties, and other influential entities teach us about difference, human value, and acceptable behavior. And within the confines of our private homes, there are all sorts of scripts that are being read. And there's scripts that are acceptable at work, that are not acceptable at home, and there are things that are acceptable at home that are not acceptable at work. I think that probably where people most honestly express some of these scripts are sometimes on the internet, where the ego and the id are all blown up, and so people just are very much themselves in anonymous ways. But these are where our ideas are being formed. And this is where we walk out of our homes and all of these ideas are either confirmed or challenged. And in our quest to think differently about who we are and what we can be, we have to fully acknowledge the power of these scripts and the power of these ideas and the power of the communities that we see around us in influencing our ideas. Sometimes we can be very hard on ourselves because we come into knowledge that was kept from us before. I didn't know things were so bad. I didn't know this history. I didn't know there were communities around me that were in pain. But we have to acknowledge the fact that most of us are steeped in contexts where the truth can never emerge because there is so much confirmation bias about what the world is supposed to look like. And so the other thing this other map that I've recently thought about was about Confederate symbols, because this has become an issue that has engaged a lot of communities. Race also shapes how people view and perceive the world around them, especially in reference to feelings of freedom and fear and expression and understanding of faith. And I think that one of the things that I think is really important, as people of faith, we are comforted by certain symbols, right? We see a cross and we associate it with the deep sacrifice of Christ. We see it as a symbol of our own unity as believers. And so there's this very powerful image of the cross. In parts of this country, there's also another kind of secular symbol of the Confederacy that has also become a place of contention. And in this example, we see an image that for some is evocative of heritage and others it's evocative of terror. And so what does it mean for us to live in a world where one symbol can mean such drastically different things across a divide? And how do we, again, see symbols that are visible and invisible that also speak to some of the long-standing pain in our nation? And so with that, I want us to have a little time to reflect in our kind of constructed tables. I don't know if you just sat there because the seat was there. But if you could just spend a little time with your neighbors, thinking on this reflection. Growing up, I noticed racial inequality and racism where. So as you were growing up, or as you started to form your own kind of independent household outside of your families of origin, where did you see these types of inequality? And where did you perceive them the strongest? And so take a few minutes to talk about that, and then we'll reconvene as a larger group.
When I was, I think my family, we live in the city, but my family, my mom was in the back. Was very country, so, and the school, I was always in school, they just have middle school there, so you never realize it was different. It was just the way it was. Mexico. Of course, when I moved here, I worked in Texas, Austin, Pasadena, or IMD, and I always worked. And the language service. So all of them were migrants.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, everything, education.
Yeah. I was so shocked.
Besides, I understand generational lines.
I know.
As a kid, was up here. When pictures of Martin Luther King,
I never
like,
play with each other. You would talk
Jack's parents were pictures of him.
well,
I asked him about color. His skin doesn't have color, so I was looking for colors. And I was looking for color, like, and they're colors. And I remember a color picture. It didn't make sense. Why they call this big? But I also
I wanted to say no, but that was one cause for mad.
and then I don't think I've heard a lot about more about
I've faced it now. I remember my
as a kid I was always TV news or stuff around the house. And I don't think I knew about his assassination. I don't think I encountered a lot of people of other ethnicities. I know it. So inequality wasn't visible in that way. Or I was not much later. Which doesn't, I knew you were poor or not. I don't think I associated with race because I wasn't in a context where I had many other people. Like when I went back to DC, I came back and I still have never been, like it's before Korea, it's kind of like not the next part, I've never gone when we used to play soccer, I did know we'd have some games with Gonzaga, and it was a scary neighborhood. Yep, like North Capitol. Did I say that because it was black? Probably in my back of my head I understood that. I just didn't think of it. Like I probably did. And other inner city schools, we also competed against and speak of these are developers. They're obviously
And then it was an Italian name, but we didn't like the Italian.
and I don't think we put it together. Well, it was already made. These things are tough and scary and dangerous for black person in the city. And that wasn't until high school and competing. And that was already formed. Like, it didn't occur to me to challenge it.
The west side of the
Right. And DC had some tough times. Yeah, this was the 70s. Like 80s, I was already late 80s. I was out of college and practicing state. But as a city, tough lessons. But I remember that. You're right. It's like there were visual things that made. No, I was scary and just but the association that made was scary. Which is not fair. It's just what I understood. It took a long time to peel that back. I didn't have it now you see where it was the House of Covenants, lending power. You see what her snapshot. And I didn't know. When I moved back here, like Rock Creek wasn't private. I had no idea. And then I realized like I didn't like the hill was sort of separate. You don't really know that. And then I was like, riding my parents' buy a house in suburbs, it's just $700 in suburbs where there were food systems because they came from somewhere else. That was already just, that's what
So that's a good point. When I moved to DC from Texas, I knew like we have a daughter. So in Texas it was only one option, right? That's your school, that's it. But here it's like a several. So the first thing we asked it was that we knew it was everything. We knew it was there, but we didn't have enough time to just decide where to go. So for 4 months we lived in Michigan. And it was crazy, so we moved to DC, and they always moved this side of the 16th Street or the other side. So people knew, and I think, and when you're newcomer, you look for a safe place, and finally we understood, like Southeast side, one for my job and the other one feels unsafe. And then it is. But then in the school, it's something that we want them to be aware of. Like, we have that talk every time. Of course, it's 75% Hispanic, we only have 1% white population, and the rest is African American. That they live there, but because it's dual language school, they have to learn Spanish. So it's English and Spanish. It's something that every single day, like a student, African American student telling me, yeah, my mom told me that you have to be scared of black people. So it's like that, yeah, are you sure? Okay. And talk about that with the students, and then call them up. I mean, right now, racism, it's very...
you talk every day with the students about danger in the neighborhood when they go to school.
They said, like, you have to be scared. The African-American girl was threatening the other one that was Hispanic. I mean, I see this every single day. That's my point. She told me, like, in Texas, you never saw that. Not it was different. So I told the American kids, and you cannot touch them because then I'm gonna sue you. I'm gonna tell them off. Okay, yeah, that's right. It's just, and you navigate that. I'm not. I'm Hispanic. I was teaching in Spanish, so. But here, after Trump administration, they were allowed to say that racist laws existed there. So this little one, she's in 4th grade, and it was an issue there. So I said, yeah, my mom said that you should be scared of me because I'm black. I said, well, I'm okay if your mom said that, but I don't think this is what we want in school. So you don't have to threaten the other ones. And do you think that we are scared? Well, you should. So it became, that was this week, that was Wednesday. So we are going to have a talk with parents, and we're going to call parents, and we're going to call social workers and counseling and all those kind of things. The same thing we had the day that Trump won. The next day it was like full concerts in the school. Concerts. People that talk to the students. No, that talk to the students because they were crying, they were very, yeah, and it's been that the whole time. The students crying because they don't want to say where they live, the students crying because they don't know if this, when they go back home they're going to find their parents or not. and things like that. So I live in that community ever since. And my daughter was with me. And now she moved to Australia.
Folks, I'm so glad there's such great conversation. As you talk about your upbringing, if you want to transition to another topic, and then we'll take a short break. I want us to talk also then about our vocations. And so much of our upbringing inspires the line of work that we enter, or the types of ways we approach our life outside of the home. So if you'd like to add this dimension, though everyone is so wonderfully open and talkative, this question also about your work as well, and how you feel that your work also called you to think about racial justice, or exposed you to those issues as well. We'll talk for a few more minutes, we'll take a break, and then we'll transition to the second part of the presentation. Thank you.